welcome to the I Start Wondering podcast. And we're very excited to be with you all. I'm Dorian Martin. I am the founder of I Start Wondering, and I have the joy of visiting with Brenda Riojas, one of our great contributors in I Start Wondering. And we wanted to spend this podcast talking about storytelling. You know, I Start Wondering has a lot of storytelling. We are a group of women who come from different perspectives. And we share a little bit of what's going on in our lives as a way to connect with readers, but also it helps us really listen more deeply to our own lives and where we're going by really starting to tell our stories. And so I want to ask you, Brenda, why, because you were really interested in doing this podcast on storytelling. What is it that resonates with you?
I think as journalists, you and I both have a background in journalism. We're always telling stories and interviewing others and telling others stories. But it's important to tell our own story. Because if we don't tell our story, who will? And having lost my mother when she was 50 years old and I was in my 20s, I regret that I didn't record her stories, so that I didn't pay closer attention to her stories. And I have dug through anything that she left behind of her story and trying to recapture that. And so I started telling her story, which is part of my story, through a collection of poems in her memory. And it brought me back to my Spanish, and it brought me back to embracing where I come from, that I am, que soy una hija de la frontera. I am a woman of the border here. And one of the poems in the collection is called Those Two Lands Kissed into One. And it's where I use English and Spanish, and it just flows. There's not a translation of it. But it pinpointed where I come from. My father, who's from South Carolina, my mother, who is from Mexican, my Spanish tongue, my English tongue, my bicultural, my bilingual self, and celebrating that, yes, soy una hija de la frontera. I am here from the border. I mix my English and my Spanish at times. And while once I was embarrassed or discouraged from speaking Spanish, I now embrace that. So that is part of my story. And so when I am able to tell my own story and know where I come from, I can celebrate it and learn from it. And so there's a real power in storytelling. And if I didn't do this work, then how would my children know the beauty of that living in two worlds of Mexico and the United States, and all all the gift that is. So I think there's a real importance in sharing our stories to learn more about ourselves and embrace and celebrate where we come from, and then imparting that to our children or even to the people in our community, so that they can know better. And we're all connected too, because in sharing this story, I found that it resonated with my sisters and others who were bicultural and flowed from English and Spanish, but we didn't have words to express that, of what was that identity for us. So that narrative, that border narrative, that dual language reality, biculturalism reality, we need to understand who we are so that we can better serve and understand others as well and see that connectedness. And I mean, I know you have a fascinating history as well, and you've been doing some research on your own story. And wouldn't you say that that impacts how you see the world?
Exactly. And my story has changed significantly in the past decade. Uh, Kind of strange to say at this age. But what we ended up discovering is that my paternal grandparents, who claimed to have been born in the United States, never talked about their past. They actually immigrated from Russia. And also, we found out that they changed our last name. So actually, Martin should not be my last name. So it's really opened up new ways of thinking about what my life is, what it's about, new aspects in my, in how I think about my life, um, and new opportunities to explore in different ways about the stories that I've always told myself, which turned out not to be true. So yeah, and I think that kind of brings us, to the question, how do we tell our stories? And who do we tell our stories to? You've given it a lot of thought. So, you know, you've got kids and now grandkids. Are those your primary audience, or are there others as well?
I think it definitely my children and my grandchildren now are an audience. And I think though too, because through the columns and through my writing too with the diocese, I share my stories. It's a way of connecting to the world and learning from one another. Because if me as a journalist, if I'm going to tell other people's stories, I should be vulnerable also and tell my own story. Because as we share stories, so it's not just we tell our stories through our columns and through our conversations, and in doing that we share our stories with others because stories connect us, and they inspire, they give hope, they teach. So if through maybe some of my failures or mistakes or experiences, I can share that with someone and we can learn from that, because I know that I have learned from other stories and been inspired by that. So yes, it is for my children and my grandchildren in a way to pass on our family history and who we are, but it's also to learn from one another. um Dorian, the term that you coined, and or I've always I connect with you, is lifelong learners.
Mm-hmm.
And as we're lifelong learners, we learn from each other. We learn from each other's stories
Mm-hmm.
more than any recipe or formula in a history book or any of that. It's the stories that we learn from. And what I mean, when we read history, it's the stories that draw us in. It's not just the data and the timeline, but it's the people. And so I think it's that connection with people that we are, and that every story is sacred. When I was in Hawaii a few years ago, it's been a while, they had a term about talking story. Whenever they were in having a conversation, they didn't just call it a conversation, they were talking story. And I thought that was a wonderful way to put it, because when we sit and talk, we're talking story, each other's stories. So I think, again, I hope that answered that. But it's, yeah, my family, my children, my grandchildren, but with one another. Because while we may be strangers, somebody reading my column may not know me, I have people come to me and say, oh my goodness, that story you wrote about fasting, or the story you wrote about your father, it really, I could understand. And so our stories reach others, and that we can learn from one another. Have you seen that experience in your, how do you feel about your storytelling?
It's funny because, like you, we both have done public relations. And so our tendency is to tell other people's stories as well. We put other people up front. But in the past 8-9 years, I've started telling my story more, not just in I Start Wondering, but also as we teach meditation classes and focus on how do we relax the body and quiet the mind and calm the heart. And because the type of meditation I teach is about unconditional love, which is a big topic in itself, it's really offered me an opportunity to really probe my stories of how I'm approaching life, and then also share it with people, because I'm finding, that my life is shifting in ways that I had not really thought about it. And by sharing what's happening with me, and hearing what other people are going through, it's almost like we're linking arms and we're moving together in a way that feels more in sync, in building a community of unconditional love. So the stories for me, in sharing them, have been really good. And also because, having people listen to them and sharing them, there are times I start telling a story and then I go, that's not true. Wait a minute, that's not true. And so it's that loving listener who is holding space for us, who reflects back, and they may not say anything to you, and they may not even know that there's this dissonance within yourself. But by listening, I'm able to say, I just said that, and that really isn't how I feel. This is not the story or the way it has unfolded. And so let me choose a new story. Let me choose a new way of experiencing this.
Yeah. So it's like we're learning. When we share our story, it allows us to remember and step away from, because when we live it, sometimes you need the distance, so that when you tell the story, you can see things maybe a little more clearly, and see what's accurate and what's not accurate. And this is what I remember, but maybe this is what really happened. And so it's a journey that we're learning from, our own journey, that it's a journey of learning from our own stories as well, and how we choose to remember and learn from. Like, okay, this is like, for example, here is my lived experience as childhood, but I'm going to not have that story repeat.
Yeah.
And these are the things I need to do to stop that story from continuing on into either how I discipline my children or the time I spend with them. Maybe I had a different story. That story doesn't have to continue.
Yeah, yeah. You know, and then the other piece, as you say that, that really strikes me, you know, I had some major ahas in 2021. I wrote about that I went on a 10-day meditation retreat. I took myself out into the into a cabin, not talking to anybody, and basically just, you know, had quiet space and a chance to really go deep within myself. And I didn't have much cell service, which was a good thing because otherwise I'd been looking at my phone all the time. But what I did do was take a couple of books. And one of the books I took, and this is going to be, I know, backwards, but it's Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And it's about myths and stories of the wild woman archetype. And this book got me back into the idea of myths and taking that higher view of what's going on in my life and looking at it from an archetypal perspective, which has helped me to really reframe the stories I tell myself. You know, how do I go from a victim, which, or saboteur of my life? How do I go from that and shift where I become the heroine of my own story? And what are the steps I need to take to do that? And that's shifting the narrative that we tell ourselves.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing. Again, the power of story, and it's so important. And I keep going back to, if we don't tell our stories, who will? And so that's why I think also what we do, and I start wondering, is not just share our own stories, is encourage others to talk about their lived experiences and capture those stories, whether it's through in conversation, talking story, or whether it's writing a journal, or even letters to a family member or a niece or a daughter, kind of capturing some key moments. And even if you don't send those letters out, as you write those letters or you write the story, it's fascinating. I mean, to me, that I like that quiet time of writing, because I can hear my own voice and I can see that perspective. It gives me a different perspective on what has transpired. What is that lived experience? What have been some of those challenges that we've had to overcome, or those frustrations, or those difficult moments? How has it shaped us? And I think it's important to capture that, so that we learn from them as well.
Yes, I think that's brilliant. You know, whether it's letters, whether it's journaling, even artwork, you know, drawing a picture of what, you know, you're experiencing right in the moment. You know, there are different ways to use the story, you know, the chance to tell stories. You know, and I think the other piece for me in all of this too, and part of the purpose of I Start Wondering is helping women see that this is an opportunity to live our lives. You know, I think for many women, you know, the younger years are spent, you know, focused on career, on children, on caregiving, a variety of things where we're always giving to others. And culture definitely has its viewpoints about what being a woman is in our world. And yet I think what's really important is to begin to remove thoughtfully remove, those narratives that no longer resonate,
Mhm.
and to begin to reclaim our story of how we want to live our life. And I go back, Martha Beck, who's one of my favorite people, wrote a book called Breaking Point. And she talks about how women often reach a point where what culture tells us we should do and you know, what we reach a point where there's a lot of friction in life, and she gave a great example of in the 1950s, we were, all these innovations came online, like vacuum cleaners and dishwashers and, you know, microwave ovens, which were great. They were supposed to be time savers. But what happened was that the message got flipped. And so we had to keep our house more clean. We had to do more laundry. We had to have a home cooked meal ready every night. And so really stopping and really listening to what culture is telling us we should be as women, and saying these stories do resonate, but these stories don't. And this is how I choose to live my life. This is what feels right for me in life. If my house isn't perfectly clean, that's fine. Or if there's, laundry, or I bring, there are different ways to look at it, but I think that's really important too, to begin to really come aligned to the story we want to tell.
Right. And I think too, that whole aspect of being genuine to ourselves and genuine and how we tell the story, with social media, like for example, you see these perfectly curated lives. You choose the perfect image, and you've seen those before and afters, or what you see and what you don't see, not the before but the after. But when people zoom in on this perfect corner of the room, here's what's on Instagram, and then they pan the camera, and here's what I'm not showing you. And I think when we're talking about stories, because in a sense people are sharing their stories through social media, many times curated and selected, but we need to be vulnerable and open to sharing the reality. And even if we're not on social media, if it's just, again, a letter to ourselves or a journal, or however that we're sharing it, being genuine and seeing this is the reality, this is my reality, not this one. And so that we don't have to buy in to the way the streams are going in the water, the currents of the water may be going one direction. We can go against the stream, and we can be true to ourselves. And sometimes and in sharing that genuine story, we can make that distinction. It's not all perfect. I can show you this version of my life that's nice and neat, and then I can show you the catch-all room where things are a jumble. And sometimes we choose, when you're talking about who we choose to share what, that you're in a true, genuine relationship with somebody and building a connection with another when you are vulnerable and sharing the highs and the lows of it. Because we all have, and I think I've written about joys and sorrows. We wish that it could all be joy, even though St. James says count it all joy, but that's another story. But there are sorrows in our lives and there are challenges, but in sharing that, we may not be able to share that as it's happening, but when we can come to that time to share, we can learn from that. It's like, okay, here's what I learned from that experience, and then another can learn from our experience as well. But I think there's that vulnerability, or allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and genuine in what we share in the stories.
Yes, yes. And I think it's vulnerability and then increasingly a commitment to be authentic.
Authentic, yes, that's the key.
Yeah. Yeah, being authentic to who we are. And so and that takes bravery to be able to say, my social media may look fabulous, but that's just a curated, group of pictures or whatever. I'm human and I'm flawed, and that's beautiful because we all are.
Mhm,
We
mhm.
all are. And so it's really important to begin to remove the stories of what we think we should be and to embrace who we really are.
Right, right. Yeah, there's so much more that could be said on this subject, but I think this is a lot for us to continue to think about and consider. I think we're always thinking of how best to share a story, and always our own, but others' stories as well.
Yes. Yes. So thank you, Brenda, for spending some time today. This has been really lovely.
Well, I hope that we can continue the conversation on another date too, so that maybe we can share some storytelling or ways of sharing stories, so that we can encourage others, and maybe even have a little workshop for others on telling the story. I did one with some women, some of the women who are immigrants from Mexico, and we did the session in Spanish. And it was just so empowering for them to hear their story, and providing them that safe space and the tools. Because sometimes it's like, well, yes, we can speak story, but if you want to record it, how are some other ways to do that? So I'd love to dive into that as well.
It's a date. It's a
Amen.
date.
Well, thank you, Dorian. This has been a joy. And again, so much more that we could go on and on. I do, for those who are interested, I do like this story by Lisa Cron, Wired for Story.
Oh,
It's a really good one. The Writer's Guide to Using Brain Science to Hook Readers from the Very First Sentence. And then I like this other one, First You Write a Sentence, The Elements of Reading, Writing, and Life.
oh, perfect.
So again, so much more, but I think we definitely should consider putting together a workshop for people to tell their stories.
We will do that. So
Stay tuned.
Coming soon. So thank you so much. And I so appreciate you taking the time to visit today.
Thank you.